All right, hello everyone. I am Nick Principe from IX Systems. A little bit about me first. I've been doing performance my entire career, mostly focused on file performance. I started with back in the EMC days with the EMC Solera and moved on through that product line. And I've been at IX for about a year. I started with FreeBSD with I think 4.0 release. It was the first PC I installed, or first OS I installed on the first PC I built. And I rode the train to 5 and got off, but I'm reformed now. So I want to do a quick poll. Who here has a production application that uses storage? Okay, if you didn't raise your hand, I'm going to assume you don't have a production workload. If you do, so those of you that raised your hand, how many of you have production apps that access the storage over a network, NAS or SAN? Okay. I need all of you to trace your workloads and send me the traces. We'll talk after the talk. All right, let's get started. All right, so go ahead, ask me a performance question. I'm a performance person.
How fast is Beehive?
How fast is Beehive? That's a very good question. Typically, whenever you ask a performance person a question, you get the same answer. It depends. So again, Mr. Wolf, it depends. So I hope to show you why it depends and show you at least what you can do about it to get closer to a real answer. So why do we measure the performance of things? What's our end goal? Almost inevitably, it's to compare to something else, either another product or perhaps another version of the same product, either hardware or software. And usually the level of detail that you seek in terms of the performance you're looking for, it depends on both your purpose and the value of the item. So if we look at our horizontal conveyor toasters, I mean, there's actually a lot of stuff in the spec sheet for a toaster. I'd never really looked before. But fundamentally, the only performance metric is the number of slices of toast per minute that they produce. So a commercial toaster is fairly expensive, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that expensive. So slices per minute, that works pretty well. Let's go over to cars. I think cars and storage arrays have a lot in common in terms of how we look at them. You can compare based on multiple things. And all of them will have a factor in your decision, but some may be weighted differently, depending on your circumstances. So I would love an Alfa Romeo, but based on the price, I don't think I could even afford the Mazda 6, honestly. But you can see, that's not performance, but it certainly is a factor that we compare. For cars, in terms of performance, we can look at what's the max horsepower. Usually that's a number quoted. Sometimes you'll get the torque too. And I think those equate very well to the marketing numbers you get for any product. Storage arrays in particular tend to have very high marketing numbers for it can do up to this many ops per second. And I think that equates fairly well to horsepower in an engine. If you're a real nerd, you can look at engine displacement and the amount of power per and say, oh look, the Alfa gets a lot more power per liter of displacement. On the other end, a lot of times when you're looking at a car, the EPA has basically boiled down the huge sticker on the car. Now it's 3 numbers, it used to be 2, but we have city, highway, and combined. And a lot of us looking at a car, if it has a gas engine, we'll look at the fuel economy. Sometimes you may not care. If you just want a truck to haul stuff around, then you may not care. You're more interested in power. So in the realm of storage, which is the realm that I have played in and I think a lot of us are interested in, there are a few industry standard benchmarks for NFS and now any network storage. Typically we look at SFS 2014, Spec SFS has been pretty much the de facto standard, especially for NFS testing. And you can see even with spec, we boil it down to really 3 numbers. So it's a lot like a car. But fundamentally, you need to ask, what performance do you need? The performance that you want is going to be balanced by your budget size and your capacity needs, and that works for both cars and storage arrays. And we're not all driving, 2-door Lamborghinis. Some of us have to go shopping. Some of us have to carry kids. And similar things are related to enterprise storage. Are you only running one application on your storage array? Maybe you need a small capacity, high performance all flash array. Are you putting everything on one array? Then you're going to have to factor in capacity and your budget with your performance needs. And we like to badmouth marketing numbers sometimes and spec sheet numbers. Well, okay, up to that number. Well, that's not too helpful. But it actually can be. Because they allow you to weed out, certain choices based on, I need more than the maximum ops they claim. So you could rule out that vendor, HBA vendor, storage vendor. But you have to take all those numbers with a grain of salt because your applications, your storage environments, they have their own quirks. And those aren't really necessarily reflected in spec sheet numbers and marketing numbers. And everyone has different, I would say you have a minimum performance requirement. So a lot of times nowadays that boils down to response time. This application, I can't have more than a 5 millisecond average response time or I fall over. And then there's also maximum performance needs, which can mean different things. I think a lot of times that can, you can think about in 3 years, I'm going to need this array for 3 years, 5 years. At that time, with my expected growth, I know I'm going to need this amount of ops per second. So then that comes into the purchase decision of, will this meet my needs in the future? So at this point, when you have your shiny new storage or you're thinking about buying it, we all fire up DD. Yay, DD, our favorite performance benchmark. Except it's not really a performance benchmark, but it is a load generation tool. So us performance folks, we love to badmouth DD and say, oh, stop running DD, that's a terrible thing. But we all do it, even performance people, although we don't like to admit it. Usually the first test when you set up new storage, your new Z-Pool, your new FreeNAS Mini, whatever it is, we usually do a DD or a file copy, drag and drop or command line copy. And in some cases that may be all the testing you need. Or that may be the most relevant testing to you. When I have a USB flash drive, what do I really care about? Most of the time I'm waiting on a DD to write an image to it so I can then use it. I don't really care how long it takes to install because I'll just forget about that, come back in an hour. But usually I'm like, oh, I need to reinstall that server. So I really care about the DD write performance of a USB flash drive. It's a perfectly valid test. On my FreeNAS at home, okay, I have some iSCSI stuff. I run Steam on an iSCSI LUN, but whatever. Most of the time, the thing that's going to frustrate me is how long does it take to copy a directory to it, to keep that directory safe, or copy something from it, so I can then send it somewhere else or use it if I'm not using it directly on the NAS. So basic tests can be good for basic needs and basic systems. But if you're talking about enterprise environments, and especially ZFS environments, they're more complex. So you want to look at the better tools that exist out there. And there are no perfect tools, unfortunately. And like I have in the title here, the nice thing about performance tools, much like standards, is that there are so many to choose from. Probably not as many performance tools as standards, though. So what is the perfect performance benchmark? The perfect benchmark is taking a storage array, putting it in your production environment, and moving your production to it. Really, that's not often practical. It may not even be possible. There are many reasons. First of all, your production environment is probably larger than your other environments. It supports the business. There's also the expertise required to even set that up. If you told me what your production environment was, it would take me a lot of money and a lot of time to even set that up, and I may not even do it exactly like you had it. So what do? For performance testing, we take shortcuts. We try to say, okay, that's very complex, but we can boil it down to this, and it's an approximation. Every shortcut we take slides us on this scale that I have at the bottom of the chart. So there's realistic on one side, which is your production workload, and then there's totally synthetic, which is like 4K random reads. You know, it's totally synthetic. Not that it's not useful. It is useful. But the more synthetic your tests get, the more magic it takes to make them useful for a particular investigation. So if I just tell you the random 4K reads that an array can do, well, your application is probably doing a mix of I/O size. So with magic, you can interpolate and sort of figure out what does that mean. But likely you're going to want more and need more data than that. So this is the call to action that I want to put out. Let's work together to make more realistic and standardized tests. I've been working with the Spec Open Systems Group storage subcommittee that makes the Spec SFS benchmark for several years. And participation is very easy if your company is already a Spec OSG member. A lot of large companies already are. If you're not, do get in touch with me. But I think it's a very nice forum for trying to drive the workloads that all of you are seeing in your production environments into a standardized test that then makes it easy for you and storage vendors to reproduce your environment without a very complicated test setup. So that pushes us in the happy medium between realistic and synthetic testing, which is practical and useful testing. So I wanted to touch on the load generators that I frequently use in the past and currently. So the three I want to touch on are VDBench, FIO, and NetMist. Who here has heard of or used VDBench? A few people, okay. What about FIO? Okay, more hands. And who here has used SFS 2014 or SFS 2008 from Spec? That's a surprising number of hands, I like it. All right, so I just want to go down some of the pros and cons of these. You know, VDBench and FIO are both free. VDBench is, however, encumbered by the Oracle license, which does have some restrictions on it. NetMist is not free. You do have to buy that from Spec. Because it is a product and that helps fund further development of it. The other interesting thing with performance testing is your freedom of speech. It actually is restricted in a lot of cases. And this actually goes for some vendor license agreements as well. With Oracle, there are clear restrictions in the EULA for what you can say with the results you've produced with the product. So that's a bit of a downside. With FIO, there is a moral license, basically just to disclose that you used FIO and which version, just so people could try to reproduce it. And, they know what version you used. And NetMist does, as part of the Spec SFS 2014 kit, it has some restrictions on your freedom of speech. The intent is good within Spec, but the legal language is a bit muddy. So I put unclearly restricted there. The good thing is the source is available for all these tools. Now, I would say don't ever trust a performance tool that you don't have the source for. You want to see what it is doing. If something looks really bad on your platform, you want to be able to see, is there a bug or is something not working correctly for your platform in the tool? As far as platform support, both FIO and NetMist have very good support for all the popular platforms. There's not a lot of testing, at least for NetMist, there's probably not a lot of testing on like ARM or Power. For VDBench, most stuff is supported but not BSD, so oops. But it's still decent for some other cases. It does support Mac, so it would probably be a small porting exercise. One of the most important things if you're testing a large system like an enterprise system is the ability to have multi-host coordination. One single load generator can only drive so much load against a very large system. You typically need multiple hosts to drive an adequate load to saturate any sort of mid-range storage system. And VDbench and NetMist have no problems with this. For FIO, it seems to me that the FIO server component was just not written to work on Windows, and I believe the author has acknowledged this. Someone could rewrite it to use threads instead of processes, and it should work. So that is one of my major problems with FIO, because I like to use Windows load generators to test SMB protocols. There are two things you also want to consider. How flexible is the workload definition? Luckily, all three of these tools you can define a very complex or a very simple workload fairly easily. But as far as your data set layout, so what does your data actually look like on the disk, with VDbench and FIO you can pretty much do whatever you'd like. With NetMist, it is meant to work in SFS, which has particular ways of running, so it's a little bit less flexible with the data set layout. So I have one more table about these load generators. One important omission with FIO, I really actually I've come to like FIO, but it does not do any file or metadata operations. It's just an I/O tester. Now, it's flexible I/O tester, I believe, is the origin of FIO, so that's fair enough. It doesn't make any claims about that. But both VDbench and NetMist do support file and metadata operation testing, which is very interesting for people who sell file servers, because a lot of people use NFS and SMB. So I would say VDbench and FIO are best for four corners type synthetic block testing. Both can also be used for file testing, but just doing I/O reads and writes against files. NetMist is purpose-built really for testing complex workloads that are doing file access. Pretty much it'll test anything POSIX compliant. There are some block support shims in it as well. Those are sort of early days, but if you have access to the tool and have feedback, then I think we would love to take it on suggestions to make that work a little bit more easily. So I have two cool things about each of these. For VDbench, the thing I really like about VDbench is it's very easy to iterate over multiple test factors. If you want to test a lot of different queue depths, I/O depths, queue lengths, whatever you want to call them, it's very easy to do that in a very succinct way. For FIO, there are a lot of really good access pattern distributions, statistical distributions. You can do not just pure random, but you can do a Zipfian distribution or a couple different others. They have a geometric distribution as well, which is really cool because those are more realistic than a pure random workload. Typically, you will have LBA regions or files that are accessed a lot more than others in your real environments. The thing I love about NetMist is it's very hard to get a different result when you run it multiple times, just because of the way it runs and the way it is configured. It's really cool that you can get such repeatable results. Cool thing number two about VDbench, again, the config files are very flexible. So you can have a very short config file that can run a whole lot of tests. So it's very nice to just have a small text file that you can let run for hours or days. The really cool thing about FIO, of course, is you can just do a package install FIO and you get it. That's pretty hard to argue with. With NetMist, there's really cool dataset fill patterns, so compressibility and dedupe can both be tweaked and tuned. Also the access parameters, as far as selecting certain files to be used more than others is pretty cool. And there is at least one uncool thing about each of these tools. For VDbench, it does use Java, but it does run well with OpenJDK. The load is actually generated with native calls through JNI, so that's why it does actually need a BSD port if one wanted to use it on BSD. With FIO, you can get what you want with the file layout on FIO, that's an odd sentence to say with all the FIO and file in there. But it can be very confounding to actually get it to do what you want because certain parameters are divided by other parameters to get your file sizes and stuff like that. So that's sort of uncool. And the uncool thing about NetMist is that you have to buy it. Who wants to do that? One of my favorite sayings from one of my former managers, and he didn't come up with this, we've all heard this, but you get what you measure. So that's very true in the performance world. So in the vein of that, the first thing I want to look at are your workload parameters. So this is how you define the workload that you're going to run in your performance test against the product you're testing. And these can be as simple or as complex as the tool you've selected can handle. So in this case, I've pulled the SFS 2014 workload template out of the user's guide. And I just wanted to walk through this to give you an idea for the different parameters that make up a workload. So first, probably the most obvious one is your operation mix. So what percentage of reads versus writes do you have? What percentage of various different file metadata ops are you doing? Things like get attrs or access calls, all your favorite metadata ops. So what percentage of those? The nice thing with NetMist is you can mix your reads, your writes, and your stats. Sorry, I said get attrs, it's really stat. The other, I think, obvious things are your read and write size mix. So you can say, okay, I want a 4K pure synthetic test, but in certain tools, certainly in I think all of the ones I selected, certainly FIO and NetMist, you can have multiple different I/O sizes that you test with different probabilities. So in the real world, you're going to have a mix of read and write sizes, but the magnitude of the spread and all that will depend on the application you're running. Another important thing, and I'm going to show some more data about this, is your data layout matters, and it should match your production workload as much as possible, because it does make a difference. So that's the number of files you're testing against, the number of directories you're testing against, the number of files in directories, the depth of directories. These all make a difference in performance. Also, the number of threads you're requesting, which can either be real threads or just your I/O depth, your queue lengths. And if you do have multiple threads running, what operator are they requesting? A lot of times people like to run, this thread does work as fast as it can. It just submits I/O, and as fast as it gets it back, it sends out a new request. But actually, you can learn a lot of really cool things about the performance of your array if you try to go for a certain operate. So you can call that a paced workload. There are some other terms. That also, it's sort of a factor. It's sort of a factor of think time in your application. So that's one way to simulate that. A lot of applications will have some think time. Some may not have much think time at all. Some may have a lot. So they're not running as fast as they can against the file server. And so that can drastically change the response times you're getting. Some other components, quality of service. So that's an important thing to take into consideration. If one thread is getting starved for I/O and all the others are doing fine, is that a pass or is that a fail? Well, it depends on your production environment. If you can tolerate some stuff being slower than others, then that may be fine. If not, then you want to be able to detect that and fail the test, even if the operate is still matching. But if you're starving some threads, or if you're starving your reads at the expense of writes, or vice versa, you want to know that and detect that. And then some other components here, your access patterns. So again, hotspots, hot bands, skew, whatever you want to call that, just that some parts of your data are accessed more than others. You want that to be fairly accurate, and we'll get more into the concept of active data set size as we go along here. And also file selection, which is really the same thing. Some files are hit more often than others. The content of your data matters too, especially if your storage can support compression or dedupe. And so that's where you want the content of the data you're testing to match. Now, if you do DD from dev 0 to an OpenZFS data set, well, if you have compression on, you'll get a very different number than you might expect if you're not thinking about that, because it will all get compressed. And also NetMist has some cool encryption features. If you encrypt your data from the application level, which may or may not be becoming a thing, I'm not really sure, I haven't followed that too much, but that will drastically change the content of your data. It will not be what the application thinks it's writing if it's encrypted. And then there's some other options. ODirect and OSync, some applications do require sync writes. ODirect is mostly a performance cheat. Databases use it, but mostly it's a performance cheat to make sure the client doesn't interfere with the workload that we're generating. And then the percent of commit can actually be interesting as well. Applications do issue commits at different rates. So I did some testing with FIO against just a system that I had on my desk. I used an XFS file system on an Optane device. And I tried to keep the data set size fairly consistent. 66 to 200 gigs was as consistent as I could get. So if we look at what I tested here, I tested with one file for these tests. My first test was with just one FIO job, so one thread basically, with an IO depth of 1. And you can see this is the number of ops per second that I got for reads, 50-50 mix, and writes. And you can see those are around a little bit above 50,000 ops per second. If I bump my IO depth for the IO engine in FIO just to 8, again, still one file, one thread, now I've increased performance. About, what is that? More than doubled or tripled it or so. Now reads are almost at 200,000 ops per second, and pure writes, the lowest, are about at 150,000 ops per second. So we've made one change to our workload, and we've drastically changed the performance that we're now getting out of our tool. So let's continue scaling things up here. If an IO depth of 8 is great, well, let's try an IO depth of 8, but use 6 threads. Wow, well, we've really increased the performance. We've gone from almost 300,000 ops per second for reads to, about a little over 550,000 ops per second. And the writes, now, the interesting thing here is that our writes didn't actually go up by that same order of magnitude. We went from about 150,000 ops per second to 250,000 ops per second. So why is that? Well, I just have one file, so let's keep everything the same, 6 jobs with an IO depth of 8. But now let's use 2 files. Well, now we can see the read performance stayed the same. There's no difference there, but both our mix and our write performance increased. Our writes now went from about 250,000 ops per second to about 350,000 ops per second. So that's a pretty good result. Again, we're just tweaking one thing at a time, and we're getting much better performance. But nothing in the system is changing. It's just the workload that we're presenting against that system. All right, well, if 2 files is good, let's go to 6 files. Why not? Random number. Pulled it out of my hat because it matched the number of jobs. So again, everything else stays the same. We just increase the number of files that we're running this workload against. And now our write performance is right up near the read performance. We've gone from 350,000 ops per second, now we're up to 550,000 ops per second with our writes. The mixes are still lower, that's pretty normal, especially on a solid state device. We get the bathtub curve is what we call it. So my next thought was, okay, if 6 files is good, let's go crazy. Let's go to 100 files. That's gotta be better, right? Well, it's not really worse, but it's exactly the same. So the gist of my message here is if you're gonna test performance and you're gonna use an advanced tool like FIO or any of these other tools, you wanna test multiple parameters in your environment before you settle on a methodology to run a lot more tests. Because little tiny changes can make a big difference in the performance you get. Things like the number of files, like shown here. And also your queue depth and using an async I/O engine are pretty important to getting the maximum performance out of your device under test. But let's not forget about response time. Response time matters too. So this is the same exact chart, but now we're looking at our average response time instead of our achieved ops per second. So basically, I mean, we can see here that our latencies with the single file were much higher. You can see for the writes, we're really stacking up the queue length against that one file. So basically, there's a bottleneck in the file system, OS, maybe even the benchmark tool there. So our solution in this case was to use multiple files. Now, of course, when you have a lot of threads and a deeper I/O depth, your latency will be higher than just issuing a single I/O at a time. And especially on an Optane device like this, it's actually really good at single op latency, especially for writes. So again, continuing with you get what you measure, your load generator can actually change your performance. This is the same testing, but now we're comparing a similar test case with about 8 threads against one file, or an I/O depth of 8, which is functionally equivalent in FiO. So we're looking at FiO on the right versus NetMist, just the core NetMist load generator on the right. And again, we're still running our random 4K I/O test here. And we configured these benchmark tools, the load generators, the same, but we got a different answer for both ops and response time. NetMist performed better. It showed better performance. So just be aware, different load generators can give you different answers. And you may be able to tweak the test parameters so that both tools will converge on the same answer, or you may not. But it's an unfortunate effect, and it's something to keep in mind. So here's my wall of text slide. As far as you get what you measure, there are some environmental design rules. We had the virtualization panel earlier. And yes, you can use VMs for performance testing. I've done it before, but there are some rules you need to follow. Things like disabling hyperthreading and making sure you're not oversubscribing your resources. So sort of defeating the point, the ultimate business point of virtualization. But you need to do that if you're going to use it for performance testing so you get deterministic results. And we're going to go into more of this. This is mostly for your reference. Some really big things, obviously consistent MTU. You want to be sure if you're going to use jumbo frames, make sure it's throughout your whole network and all your clients and switches, especially your virtual switches if you're in a virtual environment. You don't want fragmentation. And the other thing to keep in mind is, of course, there are a lot of limits in a system. And we're going to look at that next. But a dual port, for example, a dual port 100 gig NIC will not give you 200 gigabits per second, at least not right now. With next gen PCIe, it probably can. And also beware your PCIe switches and check your block diagrams for your servers. That's important. So I thought, let's look at bottleneck placement in a storage system. And so I made this graphic, and my first thought was that storage systems make very strangely shaped bottles. Sorry. So this gets down to, you need to design your environment. It's not just about your testing parameters, but the environment must be designed carefully, because you want to place the bottleneck at wherever you want to test. In this case, this diagram I made here, the solution is designed to be bottlenecked on the performance of the hard drives. So if we start let's start at the very top here with our load generator, memory, and CPU. So if we run this test and we were trying to test our load generators, we would get a very large performance result. Because in this case, we have a lot of load generators. So in aggregate, the performance that they could achieve, if none of the rest of this system was here, would be very high. But as we move towards our hard drives, towards our storage system, the first bottleneck really we encounter here, in this case, is our load generator network. The total network capacity of our load generators is limited by the NICs in them. So in this case, we'll never get more than this performance. This is our first bottleneck that we achieve, or that we run into, rather. So when we step out from the load generator network, we're first going to hit a network switch. Now, most network switches can switch at, line rate for all the ports on them. So they're usually not a bottleneck. But, maybe that's slower than if we did a totally cache hit workload on our clients. So once we traverse the network switch, we encounter another bottleneck here, which is the network on our filer. So the filer only has so many network ports on it that we can use, or that we're using in this case. And you can see that we've just barely managed to make the load generator network have more bandwidth capability than the filer's network. So that's good. This is the next bottleneck. When we enter the filer, typically they're very high spec systems, more than a single load generator that we use, just a single basic server. So its performance capabilities are very high, so we don't really have a bottleneck here. However, as we move closer to the storage, we hit one of those PCIe switches. So in this case, in this filer, we have a PCIe switch in our midst. So maybe it has 8 lanes going into it, and then it has 16 lanes coming out of it. So that would be our next bottleneck. Anything going through that switch will only get 8 PCIe lanes worth of bandwidth. Our next step, we have our PCIe to our SAS HBA. So let's say it's a by 8. Well, theoretically, there's no limit there, right? That's not going to be our limit. That's a lot of bandwidth that we could get. But because there's a PCIe switch before it, you have to take into account this bottleneck. So PCIe lanes to the SAS HBA may be great, but if we're going through a switch, then we've divided that bandwidth. Now, if there's no card sharing that switch, then this wouldn't be the case, right? So our next step, our SAS HBA, usually there's a controller limit on these that's, what I've seen is it's less than the PCIe bandwidth going into it. So our next bottleneck is going to be on our SAS HBA. It can only handle so much bandwidth. Now our total SAS connections, maybe we're going to an external drive array, and we have, normal SAS connections to that JBOD. Well, we have plenty of bandwidth there, and that's actually more than the SAS HBA can deliver. That's not an unrealistic scenario. So you have to be aware of, okay, my JBOD can do this much traffic. So you have to take into account that a JBOD may, it has all of these SAS connections, so it's, whatever gigabits per second, but your SAS HBA can only do so much. But ultimately, we don't have a lot of hard drives in here, so the hard drives are a bottleneck. Say we only have, 12 hard drives, they can only write at, 150 megs a second each, say. So that's our limit in this system. But you have to be aware of where that bottleneck is. And then to add on to that, you have to be aware of your active data set size. Like I alluded to earlier, if you're doing an all cache hit workload, if you're running a performance test against a 1 meg file, and you're not using ODirect on your clients, well, your clients will be more than happy to pull that into memory if you're doing a read test, and you'll get great performance. But because your active data set size is so small, you're only penetrating the entire environment to a very shallow level. So even though you designed it to be bottlenecked on hard drives, because of how the test was configured, that's not actually your bottleneck because you're just not reaching it as you go through the I/O stack. And this is nothing new. Even when we were testing single hard drive performance in a server, we've known that we have to increase the active data set size to work our way through the caches. We have to work our way through the CPU caches even for very small data set sizes. And this is even more true nowadays as we have so many levels of caching between the application and the underlying storage on the back end. Exactly, especially in ZFS, write caches are huge. It's how much memory do you have?
No, I mean drive caches. Now.
Oh, drive caches.
Right. The first system Spinetta sold had 256 megs of RAM. Now we have individual hard drives that have 256 megs of cache.
Yeah. So hard drive caches have gotten very large too. Now there are some ways to defeat caching. Direct I/O can bypass most caching most of the time in the load generators. That's one cheat that we use in performance. You can also change your cache policies. Obviously, you can turn off caching for your data set in ZFS. You have to balance whether these are realistic or not, right, for what you're trying to test. The other thing to consider is that you do need to warm your caches. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to test a 5 terabyte data set size and run it for a minute. To defeat large caches, you do have to warm them up. So typically there's a warm-up phase, or ramp time, a preconditioning workload. Those are very common in standardized performance test suites. So wrapping up, why does it depend? It depends because the workloads that we use to characterize these systems, they're an approximation of reality. And also the load generation tools we use, they vary in terms of their fidelity and the amount of fidelity we can get in comparison to a real workload. The environments that we test with, they don't really reflect production environments. The amount to which they do reflect a real environment does vary, but generally they're not exactly the same. So we have to design them carefully to place the bottlenecks where we want them for what we're trying to test. Active data set size really is underappreciated, but in a ZFS system, you really come to appreciate it. The whole point of ZFS is that you run in the happy medium where your active data set size matches well with your total available caches. So you get very good performance. And the other thing about active data set size is that the compressibility and dedupability of the data, if those features are enabled, that affects the size of the active data set size, if you will. The unfortunate thing is that both the active data set size and the reducibility of the data set are generally not well known. So generally approximations are used and we get back to being more synthetic versus more realistic. And of course we have the desire for the number. We all want the number. Does the number beat our expectations or meet our expectations? If we're lucky, we get 3 numbers. But as I'll show you in a minute, performance is a shape. It's not a curve or a point. So if I show you this, what shape is this? Could anyone identify it? We have triangle as a vote.
Rhombus.
Rhombus. All right, now we're going back to high school geometry, so I have to stop this. Polygon is a good answer. That's actually probably true, right? Yeah. All right, we have a smart guy in our midst. I picked my word for the mic. So that's that shape. But it's hard to tell when you take 3 random shots and that's what you get. Now, you can imagine if you design your test carefully, maybe you could get 4 or 5 points and then you know what the shape is, right? But I picked ones that are pretty hard to tell. So, here's the shape of performance. First, a shout out to my colleague Ryan McKenzie. He listened to my insane ramblings and crazy ideas and actually implemented them in Python and Matplotlib, so thanks to him. And he also actually ran these tests that I'm showing. So, performance is a shape. For reference, we're looking at random 4K reads. It's sort of immaterial for this case other than the fact that they're reads. I did use OpenZFS storage here. So I have the capacities of the different caches here, so that's relevant for our active data set size. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm scaling up by thread count and active data set size, and each combination of thread count and active data set size is providing us with a point, our achieved operations per second, and our average response time for that point. So if we look at the chart here, You're used to seeing ops per second versus latency probably. Those are pretty standard performance charts. And you can see our thread count is driving up our ops per second and our response time in the XZ plane here. And then as we scale up our active data set size, we're driving the shape upwards and actually drawing the shape, not the line, but the shape in our Z plane. So that's our active data set size. So let's go through and build this. When we have a small active data set size, in this case 12 and 48 gigs are what we're showing to draw this first part of the shape, we're firmly in cache hit, in arc hit. So you can see as we add threads, we're basically just adding ops and adding very little latency because we're reading out of main memory. So we can do a whole lot of that in parallel and not really increase our response time. That's pretty expected behavior. When we go one step further, this is up at 120 gigabyte active data set size, we're sort of reaching the end of our cache hit zone, not really because it was 256 gigs, but we can certainly see that we're having an effect. We're achieving fewer ops per second. We're still not seeing much of a bump in terms of response time. Oh, and I should mention that the colors here, it's just to give you an idea of the thread count. But thread count increases as these lines get drawn. So let's step up to that big jog in the shape that we saw. So this is a medium active data set size. In this case, it's the transition from the arc hit zone to the L2 arc hit zone. So we can see in this case, we're no longer in main memory. We're actually hitting a normal storage device. So we're seeing fewer ops per second out of the whole system, and we're seeing an increase in response time. But it's not that dramatic. We're still on a pretty fast storage device. When we get to our large active data set size here, we're starting to exit the L2 arc hit zone, and we're starting to push that bottleneck down to our drives. So we're increasing remember the graphic from earlier, we're increasing our active data set size, and we're driving the workload further, and we're hitting the bottlenecks along the way. But we're still not really at the hard drive. We're basically entering the hard drive bottleneck at this point with this large active data set size. So finally, with our largest active data set size, we're purely hitting hard drives at this point. You would not size your ZFS storage to be operating in this mode. You want to be down in this region right here usually. Well, you want to be in this region if you can. So as your active data set size changes, scaling up your thread count has the different behaviors like I pointed out. When we're in the arc hit zone, adding more threads increases our ops per second because we're reading out of main memory. It can handle a lot of concurrency. As we start getting into the region where we're getting some cache hits, some L2 arc hits, we have a more complex I/O path that we're hitting, and we're hitting some bottlenecks along that way. So as we add threads, we're increasing ops per second and latency. But when we're really driving the hard drives hard, adding more threads, adding more concurrency, a hard drive can only do so much at once, so really we're just increasing latency at this point. But for this storage system, for this I/O size, for this workload, we can see this is the performance shape of this system. And it's drawn by our thread count and our active data set size. There are even more dimensions you could add to this. We have to figure out how to plot a fourth and a fifth dimension though and be intelligible.
Even this, it's difficult to see it'd be nicer if you have like a render that you could then drag around and look at it.
I do have that. I didn't want to set that up for this, but it is live because it's just matplotlib, so you can drag it around. I do have some views in the backup slides. So some final thoughts here. The next time you reach for DD with that brand new storage and you want to test it, package install FIO and give it a shot. You can do it. FIO can be a little frustrating sometimes, but it has a lot of really great options. So give it a shot. The man page is really good, and it seems to have a decent community behind it. But when you do that, experiment with the different test parameters. Like I showed, a little difference in number of files can make a really big difference in the result you're getting. But balance that with reality. If your application only uses one file, well, you may get great performance with 6 files, but if your application is using one, then test with one. Now, I hope your application is not using one file. if it's a big application. Be sure to architect your environment so that the bottleneck is where you want it. Don't let a PCIe switch sneak in there and give you surprisingly low performance numbers. And consider your active dataset size. It can be hard to get a handle on it, but maybe you just test multiple active dataset sizes in your own personal testing. And finally, remember that performance is a shape. So when you get that first number out of FIO, yay, it's 1 point, but remember the graphic where we just shot a few holes and we couldn't tell what the shape really was. And I would like to work together. So if you're running in a production environment and you can get traces of your applications, let me know. Work with me, work with the Spec Open Systems Group Storage Subcommittee, and we'll try to drive those into our standardized benchmark, which will give us very useful and repeatable test results.
Can you give us examples of what workloads you guys currently have?
Oh, good question. The question was, what are the examples of workloads already in Spec SFS 2014? The workloads currently are a database workload, which tests database consolidation primarily targeted over NFS. There is an EDA workload for chip design environments, a software build workload, a big data acquisition workload, and those are the ones I remember that I can talk about publicly. So remember, we're trying to get to practical and useful, which is what I want on my tombstone. He was practical and useful. So I'll take some questions, or we can take a quick look at, do we have, am I like way over?
You can go a little longer.
Oh, okay. So let's look at some different shapes. So I just wanted to show you. This is normally what you'd get. You know, when you test multiple active data set sizes, if you just do a 2D chart, you have all sorts of lines on top of each other, and you can do log scale to try to make it look better, but it looks really ugly, at least in Google Sheets. But you know, it doesn't really look good. So if you just negate the z-axis and look at the same view in our 3D plot, that's sort of what it looks like. And it's really the same thing. Because the z-axis isn't perfectly level, you can see the points are sort of dodged a little bit better right there. But if we carry that shape forward here, you can see if we rotate it sort of down, the dimensions get a little hard. But you can see then, you know, the full shape where we can see, and it's a little exaggerated here, you know, active data set size, or the increase in response time is a little exaggerated here because of the view. But you can see sort of that same shape where it sort of clings to the wall here, it clings to the wall here, and then it wraps to connect in the middle. And just some more views. those are the last views that I had that I took. It's sort of mind-bending in a way, but it's cool. Okay, any questions? Warren.
Is there software to analyze an existing system to generate workload numbers you can feed into your load generators so you wouldn't have to try, so you could get realistic values for a particular system, but you wouldn't have to try it on that?
Yeah, so the question is there software to analyze the system and basically produce a workload file that you could feed into a load generation tool? I think there have been some commercial attempts at that. I'm not really aware of anything that exists. If you're on a system that can do dtrace, it should be perfectly feasible. Although the conversion to the load generation tool would probably be a bit cumbersome, but at least that gives you the data. So that's why I'm hoping this is a good audience to build some representative workloads. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Thank you.